I'm very, 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 very excited to have Brooke Harrington for our third Offshore Talk. I don't think you need a lot of introduction. We were very happy to grab her just after she spoke at the UN in Geneva yesterday. And as you know, she's a professor of economic sociology at Dartmouth College. She wrote several books, and she got me charmed with Capitalism Across Borders, where she really dedicated herself to research, and she took all the necessary courses to become an asset manager and really investigate for over a decade what wealth managers do and how they shape our economy and the wealth of the very rich individuals in our societies. So I'm really excited to have you here, Brooke. Thank you very much for joining us. We also have another excellent speaker with us today. Thank you very much to Monsieur Chavagneux for joining us today. And he's an economic journalist and president of the board at Alternative Économique. He wrote hundreds of articles on finance, multinationals, books on tax havens, so it's the excellent person to challenge a bit Brooke in her proposals. So I won't take any more time, and I let you the stage, Brooke. Thank you.
I'm here to talk to you today about something that isn't a particularly pleasant subject, but an important one, I think, especially for the present moment. And I'm really honored that so many of you have turned out on this beautiful day when tomorrow is a holiday. It really is a great honor that you're here, so thank you so much. I'm here to talk to you as a sociologist, and I know you get people from many different disciplines speaking to you about issues of taxation or offshore finance. So I want to start with explaining, well, what is a sociologist doing in this space, this research space? Because many people, including in sociology, think, well, economists are already doing this. Like, why does anyone need a sociological perspective? So my overall thesis is that explaining many of the crises of our century requires understanding offshore finance, because so many things, including environmental destruction, not to speak of economic and political inequality, are tied up with offshore finance. So, as we know from certain people in this room, something like 12 trillion US dollars in private wealth are out there in the offshore financial system, costing about 110 billion US dollars at latest estimate in tax revenues. That's a lot of hospitals and roads and schools that should have been built but aren't. And in addition to that, there's all the tax revenue that gets lost because of corporations' use of offshore. If you ask different people in the social sciences and in economics, well, what is offshore finance? You might get answers ranging from, well, it's a system of tax havens. Or if you speak to economic geographers, they're more focused on elite networks or global cities where the people who use offshore finance come together, or offshore financial centers themselves as global cities, Singapore, for example. If you speak to political scientists, they are talking about the offshore system as a zone of political contestation, primarily, in which taxation is sort of a secondary issue. As a sociologist, my perspective is that offshore finance is a social technology to buy and sell secrecy, which in turn underwrites all of those other activities, from tax evasion to elite contestation. So what I want to tell you about is what I learned on the inside about producing this social technology, because everyone here in this room, if you have about 2 years and maybe $70,000, you too can learn the social technology to buy and sell secrecy for billionaires. So once upon a time, there was a German sociologist named Georg Simmel. He lived in the late 19th, early 20th century, and he wrote a pretty famous article in 1906 about secrecy and secret societies. And everyone in graduate school in sociology has to read this article, but nobody actually uses it. So I decided I'm going to use this because it's full of interesting ideas. One of the things he says that's a little unexpected is the underpinning, the underbelly of inequality, economic and political, social and class inequality. It's secrecy. It all has to happen sub rosa. And he says specifically that it's the underpinning of the nobility and of criminal activities. That's where the criminals and the nobility meet, which I think is a pretty neat description of how offshore finance works these days, too. So the takeaway for sociologists that very few people have ever actually taken seriously is that if you want to study inequality, you must study secrecy. The problem is secrecy is very, very, very hard to study, as you know. That's why I had to go enter the world through the servants' entrance and spend now 17 years studying these peoples, because they don't give up their secrets easily, and they don't accept emails and cold calls from nosy sociologists or journalists for that matter. So you have to join them. And since I couldn't convince the National Science Foundation in the US to drop a $1 billion inheritance on me, tant pis, I had to become one of their servants. I had to become a money butler. So many people in this room have been part of mapping this hidden structure of the offshore world. For example, it's because of you guys that we know a little bit about how much money is out there and where it is. What I can contribute to this discussion is who built the system and why and how it works. And that's what I've been doing since 2007. And still, our maps are very incomplete. I'm a big fan of old map making. Is anyone familiar with this old map? It's a classic called the Nuremberg Chronicle. It was made in 1493 by a map maker in Nuremberg. It shows the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth at the corners, and they're all sort of governing their regions of the world. And as you can see, some of the parts of this map are in fact recognizable. You can see the Italian peninsula, for example, and there's North Africa. But India is completely missing. There's no North America. There's no South America. So sometimes when I think about what do we know about offshore, I think we're like the old map makers of 500 years ago. We're doing pretty well given how hard it is to gather data, as it was for people in the 1400s to know what the world really looked like when they didn't have airplanes or space travel to look at it from above. But one day we're going to look back on our current 2025 maps of the offshore system and kind of giggle at them the way we look at these maps and think, ha ha, how funny. So here are some familiar faces, if you pay attention to the offshore leaks. People who appear in our maps of the offshore system. It's a remarkably transnational group. Down at bottom left here, we have hedge fund manager Robert Mercer, who I'll tell you about in just a minute. This is the late former Chilean president, Sebastián Piñera. He used his offshore accounts to sell out his country's fragile ecosystem, investing in mining operations, using offshore accounts, because the mining operations were illegal and they were devastating to the endangered Humboldt penguin population of Chile. But he didn't care because there was a lot of money to be made. And then a couple of, quote, anti-corruption politicians here. This was Babiš of Czechia and Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya, and that was King of Jordan, who we now know has a string of luxury properties in Southern California. And of course, Putin and his BFFs. Why do they need secrecy? They're already rich. What's the secrecy for? Well, it's not enough for them to be rich. They have an agenda, a political and social agenda, and it's wildly unpopular. And if people really understood what it was they wanted, there might actually be pitchforks and torches in the streets. So they're opposed to democracy, capitalism, public health, science in general, and the environment. So everything good that sustains life on Earth, they don't want it, because it's an obstacle to their wealth. our survival is at stake. So it's important to minimize our ability to resist. My contention, and this may sound familiar since you've already heard from Quinn Slobodian, is that what offshore is doing with this secrecy is it's funding an elite insurgency against all of these things. I'll tell you in a minute some more detailed examples, but if you think about the most consequential and catastrophic events of, say, the last decade, the election of Trump in 2016, the Brexit vote, for example, all that was funded using offshore accounts in order to evade election laws. There's our friend Sebastián Piñera, using offshore accounts in the British Virgin Islands to get around his own country's environmental protection laws. And just in case you thought this was only about money, Peter Thiel is using the Caribbean island of St. Kitts and Nevis to conduct totally unethical experiments on human beings. The kind of stuff that, you know, IRB, do you have an IRB here? The IRBs exist to prevent exactly this sort of thing. The Food and Drug Administration, regulators in the US exist to prevent this kind of unethical human experimentation. But people like Peter Thiel and his fellow oligarchs say, we don't care, we're above the laws, so we're going to find a secrecy haven. St. Kitts also sells citizenship, as you heard from my colleague Kristen Sirac a few months ago. But this is what I mean by saying they're selling secrecy. It's not just citizenship, it's not just tax evasion. It's the power to do these sort of Isle of Dr. Moreau type disgusting human experiments. Why? Because they can and they want to. And of course, everybody's pal Marine Le Pen and her lengthy string of offshore accounts. This is a funny little headline in Italian because it's making fun of Matteo Salvini and his sovereignty rhetoric, saying, you know, he loves sovereignty so much he got his money offshore. Pretty much every European far-right populist movement you've ever heard of is funded, at least in part, through offshore. Here's a concrete example from my own country. I told you I'd tell you a bit more about Robert Mercer. When I say elite insurgency against democracy and the rule of law, this is a really good example. So Robert Mercer was a mild-mannered billionaire, kind of on the model of Mr. Burns in The Simpsons, until one day, our tax authority, the IRS, came along and presented him with a bill for $7 billion in unpaid taxes. And he went from being the kind of guy who donated occasionally to hospitals and the ballet into a sort of cartoon supervillain who not only wanted to depose the commissioner of the IRS, but he wanted to completely overthrow the US government and remake it according to his directives. So he went about it with offshore accounts. He created a series of companies in Bermuda, and he funded through that Cambridge Analytica and its efforts to psychologically target certain users of social media in the UK. They piloted this strategy with the Brexit vote. It worked just by the skin of its teeth, 2%. And then they rolled out the same strategy in the US for the 2016 Trump vote. Now, it's very debatable whether it was decisive in putting Trump in office. But I don't think anyone is arguing that it had no effect or that it didn't help Trump, at least a little bit. And the fact is, there shouldn't be people able to do this at all. Like, that kind of thing shouldn't exist. So back in 2016 and 17, actually when the Paradise Papers came out in 2017, we got the paper trail showing that what Mercer really wanted to do was make sure that Hillary Clinton never became president, because she was going to keep that IRS commissioner who had slammed Mercer with the $7 billion tax bill. There's the Brexit paper trail over there. But as an American, the saddest headline is this one. This is the headline that says, yes, everyone knows Mercer violated US campaign finance laws, but right there at the bottom, The regulator was outmaneuvered at every turn. Basically, Mercer has more power than the US government because he has such wealth accumulated offshore that he can afford better lawyers, and he has deeper pockets to fight what is essentially a war of attrition, saying, okay, you want to take me to court for violating campaign finance laws? Great. Let's stay in court for a decade. I will challenge and appeal and continue every single decision that goes against me, and I will run you out of money, US government. And that's actually a thing that you can do. It's one of the reasons our tax authorities very rarely charge wealthy people with a crime. It's not that the crimes aren't there, it's that the US government doesn't have the money to stay in court for a decade, but the billionaires do. That's how they fight each other, because not only do they not like to pay their taxes, they don't like to repay their debts either. And sometimes they loan money to each other. They have business deals. One billionaire loans money to another. Billionaire number two says, you know what, I don't feel like paying you back. And then they go through this war of attrition in court against each other. It's warlordism, essentially, but fought on a financial plane. So I told you a little bit about how I know about this. About 8 years after I was already a professor and had taught for many years, I got what I thought was a 9-month sabbatical to go to the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany, about 4 hours due east of here. And I was just going to write my first book and then go home to my job at Brown University. But for many years, I'd wanted to study economic inequality and sort of, you know how explorers of the 19th century wanted to find the headwaters of the Nile River? I wanted to find the headwaters of economic inequality. And I thought it might be somewhere in the offshore world, but I couldn't figure out how to get funding to study it because it's terribly expensive. You'll see in a minute why it's expensive. And I couldn't figure out how to convince an American funding agency to cough up any money to let me do it, because they don't really like to fund high-risk research. They say that they do, but when you get funded, it's usually because you've already published from something and you've gotten a project well underway and proven it'll work. But this was really risky. Turned out that the director of the Max Planck Institute, who's still there, Jens Beckert, he had just published his own book on inherited wealth, an archival study. So we had a shared interest, and most importantly, he had a €2 million budget to sprinkle like fairy dust annually on anyone who wrote him even a plausible 3 or 4 page memo. So that's what I did, and I got the money to do this crazy high-risk thing where neither I nor Jens nor anyone else knew whether any of these wealth managers would speak to me once I got nose to nose with them. I knew they wouldn't speak to me if I emailed or called them, but I was banking on my previous experience being a journalist at Associated Press and Newsweek. Newsweek before the crazy people bought it. That gives you a lot of training in going places you're not supposed to be and talking to people who don't want to talk to you and kind of like snake charming the information out of them. So the theory was I was going to go to wealth management training school, get face-to-face with practitioners, and ask them if they would talk to me about their work under condition of anonymity, not knowing if they actually would. I found what I went looking for, I think, the headwaters of economic inequality, but I also found this elite insurgency, which is much more disturbing. I never practiced. It's important to say I never went undercover. I never lied to anyone about who I was or where I was from. In fact, at wealth management training school, for the entire time, over 2 years, I had to wear a little badge that had my name and institutional affiliation on it. The great thing was, nobody knew what the Max Planck Institute was. They thought maybe it was a private bank, and I just didn't correct them. So that credential that I earned was my ticket to go to the professional society meetings all over the world that turned out to be my biggest data source. Thousands of wealth managers from all over the world would convene in Hong Kong or Johannesburg or New York or San Francisco or Zurich. And then I would mingle among them and listen to them present their own war stories, in which they would stand up and brag to each other about how they had outwitted HMRC, for example, or the tax agency of South Africa. And they would brag to each other about the extremely clever ways in which they had done that. It was like a secret club of teenagers getting together in their clubhouse to talk about how they'd lied to their parents and used the car overnight and gotten it back in the garage without anybody noticing. Very valuable data, kind of disturbing to listen to, but interesting. So after those first 2 years of training and getting the credential, I spent the next 15 years bouncing all over the world, going to these conferences and approaching wealth managers in different parts of the world saying, basically, I'm one of you, and I'd like to talk to you about your work. And, you know, at any moment, the number of responses I got to that, or positive responses, could or should have been 0. But it usually was non-zero. People were willing to talk to me. A few were hostile. One guy sat down with me, and he crossed his arms and said, "Are you a communist?" And I was so taken aback. So I was like, why would you think that? And he said, well, I saw that you published an article that had the word inequality in the title. And I'm like, is that all it takes? Well, I guess sign me up then. But you know, he was very, very hostile. And then he said, you know, the people, this was in the BVI, he said, me and my colleagues were talking about trying to get you deported because, you know, you have, you know, political wrongthink, basically. It was such a bizarre statement. I actually wondered momentarily if he was having some kind of psychotic break because he was an accountant threatening me with deportation. I'm like, what? And then I went back to my hotel and I had a drink and I Googled, like, can accountants deport you from the British Virgin Islands? And I came upon a story that had happened about 2 years before about a journalist from Newsweek who had been in the island of Jersey, in the Channel Islands, investigating something completely unrelated to finance. It was a child abuse scandal at an orphanage called Haute-la-Garenne. But the good burghers of Jersey decided that that was going to scare off billionaires from putting their money in Jersey. So they decided to kill her story by deporting her, having her interrogated at Heathrow for 2 hours, because, you know, the Channel Islands are sort of partly under the umbrella of the UK. And so she was banned for 2 years from entering any of the Channel Islands or from entering the UK, just because she was covering this story about child abuse in Jersey. And that's how I realized that the wealth management industry really could get me deported. So that was a little sobering. But, you know, fortunately, all that becomes data. The wonderful thing about being a sociologist is when people say scary or unexpected things to you, that just becomes data, and you can analyze it. The way social science, at least in sociology, is supposed to work is it's this very lengthy process in which you investigate a new phenomenon by doing painstaking qualitative research, and then you generate propositions that can be tested quantitatively. So after about 11 years of jumping all over the world talking to wealth managers, I produced this first book called Capital Without Borders. It came out 6 months after the Panama Papers in September 2016. And I was probably the happiest person in the world when the Panama Papers came out because I'd been spending all these years developing testable propositions such as wealth managers are the hubs of the offshore system. It's not the rich people we should be honing in on, it's the enablers. They make it all happen. And then Deus Ex Machina intervened and it dropped these terabytes of data on the world. Now, they're very messy data. They're really hard to work with, but it was something. And when I was writing the book, there was nothing. And then more data in the form of the Paradise Papers in 2017, and yet another tranche of data in October of 2021 with the Pandora Papers. So now I've really got something to work with. The problem was I didn't have the quantitative skills to do it. Like, I have some quantitative skills, but not to grapple with 7 terabytes of mess, which is what that is. But this is where I went, and the good news is that after gathering data from all these places and learning that wealth management and billionaires are not the same all over the world, they do have some important commonalities, but there are important regional differences too that are important from a policy point of view. I learned that as I said, wealth managers are at the hubs of this system, and that there is this kind of agenda on the part of many billionaires around the world, many users of the offshore system, that even the wealth managers themselves found disturbing. So one of the people I spoke to, Erica here, that's a pseudonym, she had worked for Greenpeace before falling in love with a Swiss man whose father ran a private bank. So she moved to Switzerland to be with her soon-to-be husband, and she got a job in the family business being a wealth manager because she trained as an accountant. And she was the one who said to me at one of these wealth management training classes, look, our clients are really scary people. It's not just that they're wealthy, but they think of themselves as above nationality and above the law. And this is where you can begin to see how my work intersects with that of Kristen Sirac on how these people buy multiple passports and citizenships, or the work of Quinn Slobodian, the historian, on this sort of libertarian ideology. A lot of the wealth managers I spoke to were pretty hardcore libertarians who just come right out and say tax is theft. It is my job. I have a heroic role in protecting the world's wealth creators from illegitimate and rapacious welfare states. There was one guy, well, I'll tell you about him. This guy, the fellow I'm calling Lewis, the London wealth manager. First, he said, essentially, my clients are more powerful than any national government. He started with a corporate example. Who's more powerful, Procter & Gamble or the government of France? Well, clearly Procter & Gamble, but high net worth individuals are the same way. They can negotiate their own laws, essentially, with various countries, even powerful countries. Another thing that wealth managers bragged about at these meetings, these professional society meetings they would have in places like Hong Kong and Singapore and Johannesburg and New York and Zurich, is they would brag about how countries approach them saying, Mr. X, we understand that you are, your clients are Chinese billionaires or Russian billionaires or Kazakh billionaires. We want more of their money in our jurisdiction. So why don't you give us their wish list and we'll turn that into our laws. They were selling sovereignty. Or if Mr. X was an attorney, they would say, Mr. X, why don't you draft the laws that you think your clients want, and we will pass them in our legislature. Multiple people bragged to me about that, and they bragged to each other in these meetings. Lewis here said to me, very proud of his heroic work defending piles of money from rapacious governments, he said, my clients are like squirrels, diligent little squirrels, les écureuils, who hide their nuts every year, and then the big bad state comes along and digs up the nuts and takes a portion of them. And you know what that does to the squirrels? That makes them very demoralized. And they stop gathering nuts. And that is what the welfare state and the tax authorities are doing to my clients, and I protect them from it. And I paused a moment. I had to keep my face very calm and unresponsive because I wanted to laugh in his face, like, squirrels, are you kidding me? But he was absolutely dead serious. Sometimes in qualitative research, you don't really know if someone is pulling your leg, and you have to practice a poker face, so I had to get good at that. This guy really challenged me. Then there was this German wealth manager who he was the most talkative because he had just retired after a 40-year career. And you know how retired people, they miss their jobs? And it kind of, especially men when they retire, the death rates for men when they retire are amazingly high because it like takes a part of their identity that's important to them. So this guy just wouldn't stop talking. In fact, I was interviewing him at a cafe in Cologne, and he only stopped talking when the cafe staff started putting the chairs up on the tables and sweeping around us. He finally got the hint. But one of the things that he said to me was that there's a closed shop of wealthy people. I don't know if that phrase translates out of English, but normally the phrase closed shop is only and exclusively used for union organizing. So what he was saying, to my great surprise, was it's as if there is an informal union of high net worth individuals all over the world. And he says, the richer they are, the more they know each other, because they've all gone to the same schools and they often live in the same places. They've gone to business school. They talk to each other. So it's not really a conspiracy. It's, we would call it, it's class-based collective action. It's a very old thing, really. Anyways, the key insight here is that, there's maybe 3,000 billionaires in the world, maybe add an order of magnitude, 30,000 people who have the kind of power that wealth manager Lewis in the UK was talking about, the power to move governments. It's a small group of people relative to the world population. But even smaller than that is the number of wealth management experts who make it all possible. And that's really good news, because that small group of experts can be slowed down or stopped. And the upshot, the policy upshot of my research is to explain exactly how that can be done. First, I just want to walk you through some of the things I learned about the mechanics of secrecy. This is a 5-minute version of what you learn in 2 years in wealth management school. The first thing you learn in wealth management school is to be a kind of magician. You know how magicians make the rabbit disappear into the hat? That's what you learn in wealth management schools, how to disappear that rabbit into the hat and then make the rabbit appear somewhere else where you want it, somewhere where the rabbit won't be taxed, for example. There actually is or was a UK wealth management firm whose motto on its website was, "I want to be invisible." And I think that could be the motto for the entire industry. The game is make your wealth invisible by creating uncertainty around who owns what, because that in turn makes it very difficult to impose any sort of legal rule of law on it. You can't tax it, you can't collect debts on it, because you end up in these long, drawn-out legal processes with people arguing about, well, does Mr. X really own that mega yacht, or is it his 5 layers of offshore trusts and corporations? Strategic ambiguity is another way to put it. So when you sell secrecy offshore, part of what you're selling is a legal regime where maybe in theory your corporation has to produce accounts every year, but no one is ever going to see them. There's no public record. Sometimes these offshore jurisdictions will even deny access to governments with subpoenas, governments with treaties with the Offshore Financial Center. They play little games to prevent vital information from getting out, vital information that would tie offshore corporations, trusts, and foundations to specific individuals who are subject to tax or debt collection or what have you. This is an image from one of my wealth management textbooks. I put it in Capital Without Borders. And this is a simple, elementary structure that we were taught to create. And as you see at the bottom here are actual assets like a family business or a couple of stock portfolios, a yacht, and some real estate. And the game is to create kind of one of those Russian nesting doll sets around it. Each asset is ring-fenced in a company, and then one or more companies are bundled into a trust, and then the trusts are bundled into a private trust company, and usually that in turn is bundled into a foundation or a different kind of trust. And the real kicker is that each of these companies and trusts and superstructures are in different countries. So if you're a tax agency or a debt collector, all you see is this top layer, the tip of the iceberg, as it were. And then you have to drill down through at least four legal layers to get to the thing that you want, the asset that you want to tax or regulate. Each of these is going to be in a different country under a different legal regime, preferably in a different language, to increase your transaction costs to the point where it's simply unaffordable, even for wealthy countries with big government regulatory bodies. They just can't justify the expense to taxpayers. Like the IRS could go after more Robert Mercers, but then the IRS would have to face Congress and say, yes, we spent 10 years and $10 million, that would be a very low number, going after Mr. Y because we suspect him of not paying taxes to the tune of $10 million. And yes, that means that a bunch of American schools and roads and hospitals didn't get built. Sorry, it was all worth it. That's very hard to say politically, and nobody wants to be the politician who advocates for that. So it just doesn't get done. My job as a wealth manager, what I was trained to do as a wealth manager is basically ratchet up transaction costs for anyone who would want to know where my clients' assets were, to the point where it became practically impossible to attribute ownership to anything. And of course, there's a political aspect to this, in which you're exploiting the fact that regulatory regimes around the world are based on sort of a 17th century Westphalian system where people and wealth weren't nearly as mobile as they are today. The upshot of that is, in wealth management school, you're taught to regard national boundaries much as you would regard shops in a shopping mall. You know, you don't have to show a passport to go from one store to another within the mall. If you're looking for a particular thing, you just go to different shops until you find what you want. The irony of this is, think of all the poor people and the refugees who are trying to seek safety and a better life in another country. All the people trying to get into the US right now being thrown in Salvadorian slave prison, basically, with no due process. But people from those very same countries, say Venezuela is a classic example, there are still very rich people from Venezuela. They buy themselves a couple of passports and suddenly the world is their shopping mall. They can go to the US for certain laws and certain assets they want to place there, or they can go to Singapore, or they can go to Switzerland. All doors are open for them all the time. And this is where things get really gross, where it's not just that the uses of these offshore billions include buying politicians, it includes access to writing the laws themselves. Nothing really prepared me to be face-to-face with people who would brag about that. Nobody I saw who bragged about writing the laws of other countries, sort of over and above those countries' own legislatures, seemed to have any awareness of what a complete perversion and mockery that made of democracy. They were all very proud of themselves. They thought it was cool. Not incidentally, these folks also have a big hand in writing the sanctions regimes that affect them as professionals. Because it's not just the clients and the money that are transnational, the professionals themselves are transnational. So this is a very surprising thing in the world of sociology, because traditionally sociology has always framed professionals as people who are licensed and controlled by the state. I can't just roll up here in Paris and say, I'm a medical doctor, give me access to your hospitals. It doesn't work that way. I have to get licensed by the government of France, right? Same thing if you're a French physician and you try to go practice in America. You have to get licensed not by a federal system, but by one of the 50 states to practice. Same thing if you're an attorney. There's even a version of that for accountants. But if you're a wealth manager, there is no national boundary. That doesn't exist. In fact, if you're found to have committed some professional misdeed in one offshore financial center, no problem. You just pick up and go practice at one of the others. In fact, that is a very common career path, to work for decades in different offshore financial centers and kind of get some world experience, much the way people in the military are seconded to different bases around the world. The result of all of this is you're producing a group of people, these elites, who can engage not just in avoidant behavior, kind of in the gray area, but in frankly illegal activities, essentially without consequence. So I have a particular beef with this guy, Kevin Trudeau. He's from my home state of Illinois in the United States. And all throughout the 90s, he wrote a series of increasingly fanciful conspiracy theory books like Debt Cures, They Don't Want You to Know. I love that they put scare quotes around the they. He should have been a joke, but he became a billionaire through selling these stupid conspiracy books to Americans, like a whole series of them, not just about debts, like Health Cures They Don't Want You to Know, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, the federal government caught up with him, convicted him, and fined him $37.5 million. Guess how much of that fine he has paid? Null. Nothing. Zero. Because he had a wealth manager who put his fortune in a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust. Does anyone know about the Cook Islands here? They're part of why it's so expensive to study the offshore system. They're a little island chain in between Tahiti and Fiji. You can get there via a 12-hour direct flight from Los Angeles, but it's the complete Wild West. And it's an instrumental location for the elite insurgency because the Cook Islands, they don't offer any laws that would help you reduce or eliminate your tax burden. They have nothing to do with taxes. They are in the business of asset protection, which means if you're doing something sketchy or frankly illegal and you want to make sure no one ever touches your criminal gains. Remember where I was talking about Zimmel and how the aristocracy and the criminals meet in the world of secrecy? Perfect example. The Cook Islands are where you go if you want to, as one Cook Islands wealth manager told me, he bragged to me about how he helped a client take out a $500,000 loan from Bank of America. The man then declared bankruptcy, put the $500,000 in a Cook Islands Asset Protection Trust and told Bank of America, sorry, can't pay you back. Now, if I borrowed $5,000 from Bank of America and said, sorry, I can't pay you back, Bank of America would be, getting a lien on my house, basically getting the legal right to sell my house to get that money back. But if you're this guy with a wealth manager in the Cook Islands, what Bank of America does is it takes one look at the Cook Islands asset protection legislation, which makes it virtually impossible for any foreign entity to access the funds in a trust, even if they know those funds are there. Bank of America, rich and powerful as it is, took one look at the Cook Islands and said, no thanks. So they walked away. They let the guy keep the $500,000. But of course, it's not a charity, right? So what they do is they hike up fees for people like me. They increase borrowing costs for everyone else. By the same token, somebody pays the taxes that the ultra-rich aren't paying. 20 years ago, Charles Rosati, who was the commissioner of the IRS at the time, he said, by his estimate, every American paid an invisible 15% surcharge on their income taxes because the rich in America weren't paying their fair share then. We know from your work that use of offshore among the ultra-rich has only increased since then. So who knows what the invisible surcharge is, 20%, 25%? It's non-negligible at any rate. And hardly anyone knows that they're paying it. It's secret, so there's no resistance. Here's another example. Anyone remember that song that was very popular in the late 20th century, The Wind Beneath My Wings? She's the songwriter, Denise Rich. She was the ex-wife of Mark Rich. Any old people here who remember who Mark Rich was? He was an American commodities trader who made a fortune trading oil with Iran after the revolution when there was an embargo going on between Iran and the US. So he blatantly violated US law, made tons of money on it, and became a tax exile, and what's the word? An exile from American law. He put all of his ill-gotten gains, his criminal gains, in Cook Islands Asset Protection Trusts. Oh no, and that's why, 5 minutes, and that's why Denise Rich gets to live on a yacht moving around the world. She lives off of Cook Islands Asset Protection money. Looks pretty comfy, huh? And this is the former beauty queen from Colombia, who is now the Baroness Thyssen-Bornemisza, whose husband bequeathed her a £7 million art collection that normally would be subject to the UN Commission on Human Patrimony, but that would cramp her ability to make money loaning out her art collection. So she registered it also in an offshore trust so that she could make tons of money violating the UN Convention. So now for the good news. I told you that like the way things are supposed to work in sociology is you generate qualitative testable propositions and you go out and you test them with quantitative data. So the main testable proposition I had from all of this ethnographic work, that's what you call it when you go immerse yourself in a group of people and interview them and observe them over long periods. The key insight was all of this system revolves around a very small group of experts, wealth managers. Well, that's a vulnerability. And we can see and test it in the offshore leak data. At Dartmouth, I found a network scientist and the chair of the computer science department who could help me work with this very difficult data set. 2 years ago, we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, little mini journal called Nexus, in which we actually showed what these offshore networks look like. And they show what I thought they would show, which is that the offshore networks, particularly of billionaires from autocratic societies like Russia and China, look just like airline networks. They're hub and spoke structures, like a bicycle wheel. Generally, those networks are very robust, except if you know how to target the hubs, if you can identify the hubs and target them. Well, it turns out those hubs are wealth managers in the offshore system. A very small amount of them link many, many elites to each other, and those elites to their offshore fortunes that give them their power. By the way, this suggests why many decades of sanctions efforts have not been nearly as effective as people expected them to be. Like before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, for example, many of the people who were sanctioned subsequent to that had been sanctioned many times before by the US, the UK, the EU, you name it. And they just kept on keeping on like it was a speed bump at most to be sanctioned. This suggests why, that the sanctions weren't targeting the real source of power in the offshore system. So I'm just going to show you a brief example of what I'm talking about. It turns out that many of the sanctioned oligarchs subject to sanctions after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine were in fact names that you find in the offshore leaks databases. So we looked at those people and we found that all of them could be connected within 124 nodes, which is quite a small number of nodes. This is what the system looks like here. This, when I say like a bicycle wheel or like an airline network, the yellow dots here, those are the wealth managers. And look at all the things they connect. It turns out that wealth managers don't just link oligarchs to their offshore fortunes, but to other oligarchs. Markham, for example, which is based in London, works with the entire Rotenberg family. Okay, maybe that's not surprising, it's one family. But they're linked also to other key oligarchs whose names you may remember from the post-February 22 news coverage. Has anyone here ever seen the original Godfather movies? So you know, the Corleone mafia family, they have an attorney, this German-Irish attorney named Tom Hagen. And he's the guy who ends up, oh, spoiler alert, plug your ears if you don't want to hear this. He's the guy who puts the horse's head in the film producer's bed. Like, he knows where the bodies are buried. He knows all the Corleone family secrets. Don Corleone actually considers adopting him into the family because he's like ethnically different and he's not a blood relative, but he knows as much as a blood relative. And he uses his expertise to connect all of the members of this extended mafia family. This is how people who have secrets have to work. All of their secrets have to be centered in a small handful of people because the more people who know the secrets, those are more leak opportunities. So you've got to keep those secrets close. Center them in just a few people. That's what we see here. The patterns for oligarchs and billionaires from more democratic societies look very different. They're not so centered on a handful of wealth managers. But for Chinese and Russian oligarchs, this is what it's like. They not only use many of the same wealth managers, just the way you might think celebrities use the same hairdressers and stylists, not just because of their innate talent, but because they know who can be trusted and who cannot be trusted. They don't want pictures of them with curlers in their hair leaking to the tabloids. So only a few people can be trusted, and it's the same with wealth managers. all these wealth managers are taking their business to a few watering holes, like the third floor of the Yamraj building in the BVI. I'm just going to rush through this. I'm so sorry. I can come back and do questions about it later in the Q&A period, but I want you to look at the green lines and the blue lines, which represent China and Russia, respectively. They're the networks of Chinese and Russian oligarchs offshore. Basically, what this shows is that if you were to simulate removing one or two wealth managers from the networks of these oligarchs from authoritarian countries, you can essentially collapse their entire network so that, as a practical matter, they wouldn't be able to access their offshore wealth. Kind of like what happened when some of these oligarchs were sanctioned in February 22. Do you remember reading news reports about how Peter Aven and Lex Friedman were whining to the papers about how they couldn't afford to pay their cooks and chauffeurs anymore, and how were they supposed to eat and get around London? They felt very sorry for themselves because their access to their offshore wealth was cut off temporarily by sanctions. This series of experiments shows another way to do that, which is effectively to sanction the wealth managers, knock out the hubs of these offshore networks. Now, that doesn't mean stopping people from being wealth managers or shutting down the profession, not at all. What it means is taking what is actually a very old legal strategy that was developed in the Cold War to limit how nuclear scientists and chemical weapons experts and so forth could work with and share information with certain people. Starting in about the 1950s, the US and parts of Europe began passing laws that said, if you're a nuclear expert or a chemical weapons expert, you are not allowed to talk to the following list of people. Sometimes they were sanctioned people, sometimes they were anyone from a country that was considered an enemy. But there's a very solid, decades-long legal basis for doing this, saying you can practice your profession, but just not with certain people we designate. This was implemented by the US, the UK, and the EU against wealth managers in sort of a trial way after 2022, and it seemed to work very well. What I'm suggesting is we should do that a lot more. Big picture, what I'm trying to do here is revive the concept of secrecy and the study of secrecy as a major analytical factor in inequality. To turn attention to the overlooked role of transnational professionals, that is, experts who are not subject to state control, and then in that way making them difficult to sanction in some ways. I've written about that separately in sociological journals. And then what I'm doing now is that I just managed to squeak out a National Science Foundation grant at last to study secrecy. Any day now, I'm waiting for a call saying your grant has been canceled by DOJ. But so far, thanks to secrecy, I've been flying under the radar. But what I'm doing with my colleagues at Dartmouth in computer science and network science is trying to look more broadly at distinctive regional and national patterns in oligarchs' offshore networks. I told you we found distinctive patterns of people from authoritarian versus less authoritarian or more democratic countries. We're now taking this analysis global. And in fact, we're trying to rope in data on mega yacht transit patterns and private jet flight paths to map patterns of elite sociability, kind of building on that quote I showed you from Lewis and from Dieter, talking about how all these wealthy people at a certain level kind of know each other and have known each other a long time. Testing this idea of like, how do the patterns of elite sociability match up against patterns of capital flows for these people? And I'm guest editing a special issue of a journal, deadline in about 2 weeks, in case anyone has any work they would like to submit. All on offshore finance. We're very open to different methods and approaches.
Two things. First, I'm not an academic, I'm a journalist, and I agree almost 100% with what Brooke said, so that will be... thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak about offshore finance because it's always a topical, very topical issue. Many politicians are interested by offshore finance. I took just one quote from one politician, if you can read it right. It's very much to the point of what Brooks said. Just for fun, do you know who said that? Do you have any idea? Right, 1912. Jean Jaurès. You know who Jean Jaurès is, right? So it's not like we're discovering the issue of offshore finance, right? I've got a few books in my office written by specialists explaining that rich people are using Switzerland, Belgium, London to hide their money, and they're using wealth managers. Well, the term is not wealth managers, but the idea is there to hide their money abroad, right? So it's a long story. We know for more than a century that rich people, ultra-wealthy people are using offshore finance to hide their money. But then, back in 1999, I started to be an economic journalist in 1998. And in 1999, I wrote two long papers about tax havens. Actually, it was offshore finance. And of course, as a journalist, I wanted to make some interviews. So I went to see my friend economist. Oh, come on, Christian. Come on, I mean, don't waste your time on offshore finance. I mean, it's a marginal issue. You've got a few wealthy people, maybe a few mafiosi using offshore finance, but it's a non-issue. Don't waste your time with that. So I went to see judges, because judges already in 1996 had published the Geneva Manifesto saying every time we tried to grab some money from bad people or wealthy people, we are blocked. The prohibitive transaction costs that Brooks was talking about. Yes, secrecy is there, and we've got some problems. So the judges were the people I was able to interview back in 1999. But I didn't listen to my economist friends, and I continued to work on offshore finance. Why? Because I've been trained as an international political economist at the LSE with Susan Strange. I had the possibility to work and exchange with Susan. And just before she died in 1998, she published Mad Money. Mad Money, 1998. And you've got a whole chapter on tax havens saying that, okay, criminals are using offshore finance, but also multinationals are using offshore finance. And it's a very important issue. It just happened that 2 weeks before she died, I had Susan on the phone. She told me, Christian, if you work on something, work on offshore finance. Then my friend Ronin Palan had Susan on the phone 2 days before she died, and she said, Ronin, if you work on something, work on offshore finance. And then Ronin did it. And in 2003, he published The Offshore World, which I think, to me, is still one of the best introductory books to what is offshore in general. So when a French publisher came to me, I said, Christian, you've been writing a lot of tax havens and offshore finance. Do you want to write a book? I said, yes. And I asked Ronin. So that was 2006. And then we met with Richard Murphy, which is an accountant. We made an academic version for Cornell University Press. Sorry for taking so long to explain where I come from, but it will tell you how I read Brooks' books and presentation. And frankly, we were interested by tax havens, but how globalization really works, we were trying to push the idea that tax haven offshore finance is one of the key infrastructure of globalization in general. Not, okay, tax issues, tax receipts, tax fraud is important, but really offshore finance is more than tax. It's a very important infrastructure of globalization. So we are 15 years later now. And Brooks is publishing books, and others are publishing books about offshore finance. 15 years later, what do we know? What do we know for sure? I mean, we had many works, many books, many articles 15 years ago. Now we're 15 years later. What do we know for sure about offshore finance? Why don't we know for sure about offshore finance? What can we do about it? Well, first thing, it's no more a marginal issue. That's a good point. That's a good point. Why? Because I think it goes back to the 2008, 2007 and 8 global financial crisis. Then, if you go to the declaration of the London Summit in 2009, you got a whole page saying offshore finance is a very important issue. So if the Prince says that it's an important issue, you know that economists, they the prince advisors. So when the prince said offshore is important, then the economists say, well, offshore is important, right? It's no more a marginal issue. And if the economists say that it's important, then historians, sociology, etc. say, if economists and the prince say that, it is an important issue. I'm not sure it's working like that, right? But that's how I tell the story to myself. And now you've got Friday seminars in the Paris School of Economics, and you've got Offshore Talks, and it's all normal. And you've got many papers every week working on publishing economists, people coming from all social sciences working on offshore. But mind you, you're very lucky. A few years ago, it was very difficult to work on offshore. So what do we know? I think we're not facing a few individuals when we're facing secrecy and offshore finance. Secrecy is an industry. You need to move money, so you need bankers. If you want to avoid tax, you need tax expertise. If you want to organize this legally, you need legal experts. If you want to have legal experts, if you want to be a wealth manager, I say, come on, you should work with me, not with this other wealth manager, not with Brooke, come with Christian. It's more important. You know why? Because I innovate. I can propose to you new products which will be even better than Brooke's products, right? And then I have to, when I invent new products, I have to sell it to the rich people. And then, of course, I need some accountants to organize all this. And that's why we need wealth manager. If I'm a rich guy, I don't want to talk with a banker, with a tax expert, a legal expert, an accountant. I want to talk with the one person. The less person I interact with, the better it is. So I need wealth managers. We know from Gabriel's works 10 years ago also that we're not talking of the same magnitude around the world. If you're South Korean, you don't have very much money in offshore finance. If you're living in the Emirates, in Russia, etc., you have many more money hidden in offshore. What we don't know, okay, maybe you can give me a list of what you think we know about offshore finance. I made it short because I'm more interested with what we don't know, because I've got Brooke here, so I've got many questions to her. What we don't know about offshore finance? Well, as she wrote in the last book, if you look at the Forbes 500, in France we have the Challenge 500, the richest people in the US and France. How much do we underestimate the real level of their wealth? I mean, what is the real magnitude of the problem? Even with Challenge, we have a good estimate, but Brooke wrote in her book that, okay, with Forbes, we know some things, but as many as part of the fortune is still hidden. Maybe we underestimate their real fortune. Even with what we know, it's big, but maybe it's even bigger than big. Maybe so we have to know what is the real magnitude of the problem. Who are really the offshore service providers? If you go to the City of London, very rapidly you meet Appleby. It's one of the few service providers for the rich people. But then we got all these, never heard of them, never heard. It never went into the newspapers, right? But we are talking only about what I found, what the Tax Justice Network actually found in the City of London. What about Hong Kong? What about Singapore? What about Panama? What about etc. etc. So I guess it's more than a few hundred people. I think it's more than a few hundred people. I think it's thousands, maybe 10,000. I don't know how many people there are, but all these wealth managers, we're not fighting a few people. We are fighting really an industry. How much does this cost for a rich? Maybe, Brooke, you can answer that. Because I saw different papers. Someone said, okay, if you hide money of someone very rich, you take 8%. Someone else said in another paper, 30%. Well, if someone is really soaking the rich, it's the wealth manager. If you were able to take 30% of the wealth of very rich people, you make a lot of money. I don't know if you have any idea, Brooke, about how much it costs to hide the money from not rich people. That's the most important question. Where is the money? For sure, the money is not in the Bahamas, in the Cayman, in the Cook Islands. The money is not there, right? Why? Because if you want to summarize offshore finance in a single, very short sentence, I would say that it's a pure legal device. device to do what? To separate the location where you hold a property, you own a property, whether wage, profit, dividends, anything, a yacht, anything you want to hold, and the location where it is registered and so controlled and taxed. That's a pure legal device. My money is there, but everyone thinks that my money is there. And when it's there, it's not controlled, not taxed, etc. But where is the money, actually? If you're an economist, if you want to know how much money crosses cross borders, then you've got what we call economists balance of payments. So each time I'm giving money or lending money to someone in another country, I'm a creditor to another country. And then all the people in the other country are debtors, right? So if you take the IMF data and you sum all the credits and all the debits, it should be the same, but it's not. It's not. You've got about the equivalent of 10% of the world GDP for which you've got debt, but nobody is owning these debts, you know. Okay, you declare when you have a debt, but what you own, when you have the creditor, you gain interest, you gain dividends, and you don't want to declare it. But the magnitude is very impressive, and it's growing from the mid-2010 and 15. So, what can be done? Very quickly, we have automatic exchange of information for rich people, the 2% minimum tax, Gabrielle, and fighting intermediaries, what Brooks is advising. Automatic exchange of information. 123 countries contributing, 123 million accounts for about 12,000 billions of assets. Okay. It's quite important. Global evasion report last year. Gabrielle presented it. This graph, we had about 10% of wealth hidden in offshore. Now, thanks to the automatic exchange of information for tax issues, we're about 3%. Okay, it's not perfect. We don't know which countries is giving what kind of information. We know that part of it is hidden in anonymous real estate investments. Okay, it's not perfect, but we are making some progress. We know that the geography has changed. Asia is now the economic center of the world. Looks like. Next step, the 2%. I mean, I think everybody here knows what I'm talking about, so I'll be quick. Okay, fighting intermediaries. 2016 and 6, sorry. OECD. Yes, the Seoul Declaration. Just have a look at it on the internet. Very strong words about tax intermediaries. They are the people, these managers, these wealth managers, they are the intermediary, they are the people who makes all this industry working. You know, we've got bankers, legals, accountants, blah, blah. On the other side, you've got rich people. Tax intermediaries, frankly, we have to do something about it. Then, 2008, a report, study into the role of tax intermediaries. Boom, very deceptive, nothing in it. No, you know, these tax intermediaries, they help finally people to want to have savings, to find investment, you know, optimal, etc., etc. Very deceptive. Why? I don't know, Brooks, if you have any idea of why politically the G20 who pinpointed the issue. Yes, it's an important issue, and we will do nothing. Okay, we have something done about the ultra wealthy. We've got other issues where the OECD, G20 has been working on. This was pointed as an important problem, but nothing was done. Frankly, I don't have the answer, right? But I'd like to understand why. I finished with other issues. Ultra wealthy is, yes, it's important, but multinational companies as well. I really like this special issue of the review of international political economy with the special checks on global wealth chain. Yeah, you know, we've got an international division of labor when you are a multinational, but we've got sort of international wealth division, an international division of wealth, you know, with all these affiliates all over the world. And I think that this special issue is really, really interesting to understand what is happening, the relationships between multinational companies and offshore. Then we've got, if you look carefully at the 2009 London Summit final declaration, it's explicitly written that offshore finance is a problem for financial stability, that offshore finance is encouraging financial instability. So it's clearly written, no work on it, no books, few articles. Frankly, something is missing there. If you want to have an original subject, if you want to work on offshore finance, you want really to make progress in our understanding of offshore finance, frankly, the links between offshore finance and financial instability. Just put one graph, you know, the share of shadow banking as a share of national financial assets. Usual suspects, you know, Cayman Islands, Ireland, Luxembourg, blah, blah. It's very scary, you know, it's very scary because we've got links, of course, between this shadow banking and banks. And if we've got problem in shadow banking, you can have problems with banks. I was listening yesterday night to a conference organized by Better Markets in the US about deregulation, banking deregulation in the US, actually made by the Trump administration. And it's really, really, really scary. Talking about Trump, yes, another one, another problem is there, not only multinational and offshore finance, but you've got people, you know, at the IRS. Biden had put a lot of money to try to combat, to fight against these tax fraudsters, to fight against tax avoidance, etc. And unfortunately, Donald Trump, or the Doge, I don't know who, has been firing the most important people who were fighting against these people. So I guess we will need at least 15 years again if you want to close offshore, which is only open for fortune only. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Brooke, if you want to answer to the questions that were sparkled through the presentation, and then we will open the floor for any questions we have, even if we are 20 years late, apparently. So.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was fascinating. I learned a lot. Did you make that graphic?
Frankly, ChatGPT made it.
That's probably the only really great thing I've ever seen come out of ChatGPT. I like it a lot. I guess the question that stuck in my head was the very simple, practical one of how much are wealth managers actually making off their clients? I never heard of anyone making 30%. I would imagine maybe if I worked for like Pablo Escobar, I could get away with charging that, but I'd have other problems by that point. You know, I'd worry that he would sick his untrained hippos on me or something, or his various killers. Normally, there is a sort of flat fee for assets under management, but it's much more modest, I think, like an order of magnitude more modest. But it's still a very comfortable living for a wealth manager. If you're only making 3% of assets under management, you're still doing pas mal, you know, with a billionaire. Typically, your access to wealth management services is much like the access you would have to bespoke clothing. You know how in the wonderful world of designer clothes, there's couture at the very top. If you want to buy a dress off the runway, your entry-level cost is maybe, I don't know, 40,000 euros? That's not my world, so I have to guess. You can also get semi-customized clothing, pret-à-porter, maybe for half that. So it's a look from the runway, but it isn't made to your body. It's just sort of, you can tailor it slightly. And then you get off-the-rack clothes. So then maybe you pay $5,000 for a look-alike sort of dress. It's still expensive. It's still something that a middle-class person couldn't afford. But, you know, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu had this wonderful phrase about how the rich aren't a monolith. There are layers amongst them, and there are dominated fractions of the dominant class, as he liked to say. Wealth managers are among them. And interestingly enough, many of them said to me outright, I never want to become like my clients. They are miserable people. One guy said to me, an American who works in Switzerland, he said, I tell my colleagues, if I ever become like our clients, just shoot me. Because this was the same guy who said that he had clients who honestly believed that they were the descendants of the pharaohs and destined to inherit the earth. Like the kind of stuff that would get you involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital if you were poor. But if you're a billionaire, they indulge you and say, yes, yes, Mr. X, right, let's move along now. So some of these wealth managers are content to be a dominated fraction of the dominant caste. You know, as the famous rap lyric goes, more money, more problems. So they want some of the money and some of the privileges that go with that, but not all of the problems. And among those problems are not being able to trust anyone, including your friends, your own family. And so that's why they center their business on just a handful of wealth managers, especially the closer you get to the haute couture level of wealth management, and the more you come from an authoritarian society. You only want one Tom Hagen. You only want one guy who knows where the bodies are buried, because your secrets are explosive. Oh. I can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. Yes, great. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So something I wonder, you depicted the US as being a very weak enforcer of tax evasion, tax avoidance type of crime, and yet it's famously a very strong enforcer of other type of financial crime, right? Especially, if you have private information you use for trading and so on, and we keep on hearing even recently of very long prison sentences for other type of crimes. I'm curious a bit of what's your opinion of why there is such a difference.
I think this is actually a very common pattern. Have any of you here worked on the cum-ex scandal? Do you know what that was? So all over Europe, a group of traders figured out that they could essentially submit fake corporate tax refund documentation to welfare states all over Europe and get money back for taxes they never paid, often for companies that never existed. So I think billions of euros were ultimately stolen from the treasuries of many European countries, perhaps none more dramatically than Denmark. And I just happen to know about this because I was a professor in Denmark for 9 years when this was happening. So as you may know, Denmark has a very strict tax regime. Their tax gap is like something like 2%. So they know everything about you. Every krona you make, the Danish government knows about it, and you can't get away with anything. Even if you have like a fine on the metro because you didn't buy the right kind of ticket, that kind of an assessment gets filtered through the tax agency, and if you get a tax refund, they'll take it out of your tax refund. It's tightly coordinated. But for more than a decade, the Danish tax authorities that are so strict on domestic audiences knowingly allowed foreigners to submit fake corporate tax returns and basically opened the treasury to these people and shoveled out the krona because they were afraid that if they enforced the law on foreigners too strictly, that it would shut down foreign direct investment in Denmark. And there are actual records of conversations and emails in which, say, finance ministry people tell the increasingly alarmed members of the tax administration, yeah, we know that there's some shenanigans going on. There's some foreigners who are submitting fake claims, but we're going to let them do it. We're going to allow a certain amount of fraud to go on because if we come across as too strict to the international financial markets, we're going to lose a lot of investment. And I think that once I learned that, I started seeing it everywhere. So the US will put Martha Stewart, who was a celebrity publisher in the 1990s, they'll put her in prison for perjuring herself, lying about some insider trading that she did. But like the really big fish, sanctioned Russian oligarchs. When the Biden administration sanctioned Russian oligarchs in February and March of 2022, those very same oligarchs were taking suitcases full of cash to New York and Florida and buying luxury properties for cash with no mortgage paperwork. the state authorities of New York and Florida were helping these people evade sanctions imposed by the United States. Why? Because there's so much money in it, and it was too good to pass up.
About cryptocurrencies. Is that, from your client, from the people that you have studied, have they an opinion about that and how secrecy will be organized and perfected with the system of cryptocurrencies?
Much of the data I collected occurred before crypto was as prominent as it is now, but it was discussed, and especially among the old money members of these users of the offshore system, you can basically divide the private household users of offshore into two rough groups. There's the old money people who have inherited their wealth, and then there's the nouveau riche, and they have extremely different attitudes. In fact, wealth managers much prefer to work with the old money clients because they understand how to work with a professional, whereas the nouveau riche are much more inclined to do extremely high-risk things and to essentially ask the professionals to do illegal things. Like the nouveau riche will send an email to their wealth manager saying, can you put $100,000 in my checking account so I can buy a Maserati from the trust? And that's not how trusts are supposed to work. And if the wealth manager were to do that, they would be in violation of the law and in big trouble. So the wealth manager has to very diplomatically write back to the nouveau riche client, perhaps you meant to ask me if I would consider making a distribution for from the trust for the new business that you want to create. Wink, wink. It has to be put in the right terms to be passable legally. So crypto was generally classed in that category of sketchy, probably scammy things that only a nouveau riche client would ever want to touch with a 10-foot pole. And in fact, you see this in the trajectory of Donald Trump. I hate to use his name again, but he's a good example. Depending on how closely you follow American politics, you may have noticed that Trump has for years been a very vocal opponent of crypto. He said it's a scam, it's garbage, don't touch it. All of a sudden in June of 2024, he rolls up and is doing keynote speeches at crypto conferences. What happened? Maybe someday we'll know for sure. I think what happened is that the crypto bros approached him and said, you're going to lose, you need more money, we'll give it to you, but here's our wish list of things that you have to do for us if we put you in the White House. Like, you have to somehow embed crypto within the US federal government so that people, the market who has rejected it, they have to use it. So I'm thinking maybe one day soon we're going to find out that if you want to get your Social Security payment, which is your national pension, feeble as it is in the United States, maybe you can get an instant transfer if you accept your Social Security payment in crypto form, but if you want the traditional paper check mailed to you, you have to wait 8 weeks. So imagine approaching grandma and grandpa with that. They're not going to want crypto, but they also aren't going to want to wait 8 weeks. Back to offshore. Things may be changing very rapidly right now as we speak, in part because Trump seems to be steering the U.S. in the direction of integrating crypto in some way with the operations of the federal government. And when the U.S. sneezes, the world gets a cold. We'll see. It'll unfold over the next, I'd say, 3 to 5 years for sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Very, very educational and insightful, all of your presentations. Thank you. So the hot topic, tariffs. Putting on your sociology hat, can you provide any clarity on how and why Trump is, operating in this manner? I mean, I understand it's a balance of trade agreements, and it changes daily. It's just like completely gray and a black box, but any sociology sort of perspective there?
Are you familiar with the term warlordism?
No.
Well, you know what a warlord is, right? Kind of think Genghis Khan, might makes right. That's all Trump really has going for him. He's doing some sort of ham-handed version of the madman theory, except that because he's such a loser, he can't get anyone reputable and smart to work for him. So he's got like Z-list economists, and I mean, you guys would know better than I. Maybe I'm being unfair to the economists who work in the Trump administration, but at least some of the policy advisors he has are just like, they're notorious losers. Like, look at Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. He's got nothing. He's a well-known alcoholic who his entire career is like driving nonprofit organizations into the ground through sheer incompetence. He shouldn't be employed flipping burgers at a McDonald's, let alone running the Department of Defense. But those, on the one hand, those are the only people that Trump can get to work for him. On the other hand, by surrounding himself with people who have no other opportunities, he ensures personal loyalty. So it's really important to kind of abandon from the start any concept that there's a rational basis for these tariffs. Stupid people are in charge. People who are so stupid, I think you might be challenged to imagine just how boneheaded they are. Because, like, remember, we have 19-year-olds going through the databases of, you know, Social Security and saying, aha, we found fraud, when, you know, they don't understand how COBOL code works. The source code for a lot of the US government systems is this language called COBOL that was popular in the mid-1960s, and that, for example, if you don't know the exact date of birth of some recipient of a national pension, COBOL defaults to the year 1875, which was the year that international standards were developed for things like how dates are represented. So 19-year-old goober, who's like not even a college graduate, looks at that and goes, aha, fraud, and then declares that person dead, and they can't receive their Social Security anymore. That's the level of person that we are dealing with here. That is what is driving tariffs. I read recently in the news that the Japanese delegation came to Washington hoping to negotiate on tariffs with the Trump administration, and they ended up leaving because when they said to the Trump administration said to the Japanese, what are you offering? And the Japanese said, well, wait a second, what are you asking for? And the Trump administration had nothing to say. They didn't have a list of things to ask for because that's how unprepared and unprofessional and not very smart they actually are. So the Japanese very smartly just got up and left. What I think the Trump administration wants from tariffs is a performance or a spectacle of fealty to the warlord. I never watched The Apprentice, but I'm sure you've probably seen, everyone here has probably seen at least a snippet of reality television where everything is very dramatic and theatrical, or professional wrestling, for example, where no one is really getting hurt, but they're just pretending very loudly to hit each other and get hurt. I think that's what's happening with the tariffs. And that's why when like China won't play, they're like, no, we're not playing this game with you, Trump. Trump just kind of has to back off and save face, because it's all about perform fealty to me, show everyone that I'm the king of the world. And more powerful countries like China can just say no. A country like Japan just sort of quietly leaves Washington and waits for something real to happen. Unfortunately, it has real effects on everyday life. But you probably saw in the news yesterday that Amazon was considering listing what proportion of their price increases were attributable to tariffs. And apparently Trump instantly picked up the phone and chewed out Jeff Bezos and said, don't you dare, because it would ruin the spectacle of warlordism. Look at all these countries paying tribute to me.